Hey friends, it's me, Em again, and welcome back to my channel where we talk about all things sinister. If you are interested in true crime or if you like all things horror related, make sure you hit that like and subscribe button. That way you can join me for some morbid conversation. Now, for this story, I'm sure you noticed by the title of the video, we're going to be doing things a little bit differently today. Typically, I find a case, I research a case, and I condense it down into 15 to 30 minutes and I talk on that case. This case is going to be our first case that is going to be done in a series, and it's likely going to be a series of 3 separate videos that I have scheduled out. The reason why I'm doing that for this case is for a number of different reasons. But the biggest reason is probably because this case is the case that's nearest to my heart. This case literally happened in my own backyard. It happened in the small town that I grew up in, and it happened to a 12-year-old girl. And when I first heard about this case, that's when I honestly first started getting into true crime and shows like CSI and stuff. I was right around the age of 12 years old because I've always been pretty morbid and macabre. So, relating to the victim, I have family members that's around that age. But like I said, it literally happened in my own backyard. When I was researching this case and reading about the different areas that they went to, this case is home for me. This case is my home. Not only that, this case was the first case that I really buried myself in. This is the first case that I ever read an entire book dedicated to one case on. But this case, I believe, another reason and the final reason why I'm going to be doing it in 3 parts is because I think it deserves 3 parts. There are 4 perpetrators in this case and 1 victim. And having the backstory and having the build up is going to help keep it clear and concise and less confusing. So with that being said, like I said, this video is going to be in 3 parts. Today's video is going to go over the people involved in the case. Like I said, there are 4 perpetrators and there is 1 victim. We are going to be discussing them and their childhood in detail. And we are going to be discussing the motivation that led up to the actual night of the murder. Part 2 is going to go over the night and the next day after the murder. And part 2 is rough. I've cried a lot this week. This is a very hard story to tell and a very hard story to hear. It's hard. It's rough. And we're probably not going to be sugarcoating very much because I think it needs to be told in its full impact. And then the third thing we're going to be going over is the arrests, the trials, and the releases after everything was all said and done. This is probably one of the more violent, more graphic cases that I've gone over on my channel. It involves, like I said, it does involve a child, a 12-year-old child. It involves extensive torture and brutality. And if that's not something you can handle, you can't handle part 2 because it's awful. But I will give you another warning when we go into part 2. Today we are just going to be going over part 1, which, like I said, will just be the cast and the motivation that leads up to the actual murder. So with that being said, let's use this video today to meet our victim, Shanda, and the 4 perpetrators of the event, which was Melinda Loveless, Lori Tackett, Hope Rippey, and Tony Lawrence. As I've stated, Shanda was only 12 years old when she ultimately passed. Before her passing, she was a vibrant and involved young girl, participating in an array of extracurricular activities such as cheerleading, basketball, volleyball, and softball. Shanda originally lived with her parents, Stephen and Jacqueline, in Pineville, Kentucky, until the couple divorced when she was in late elementary school. At that point, her mother would have primary custody of Shanda, and they would move to Louisville, Kentucky. Her and her mom would move once more to New Albany, Indiana, and that's where she would be living when her life would unfortunately end. So while Shanda was living in New Albany and going to school there, she would end up getting into a fight with another girl at school named Amanda Heverin. Now, because of this fight, the two girls would end up serving detention together for about a week. And actually, while they were in detention, the two girls ended up becoming friends. And not only did they become friends, they ended up being romantically involved with each other, and they would pass each other notes back and forth that were very flirtatious in nature. And allegedly, they even got to the point where they had a sexual relationship, despite the fact that Shanda was only 12 years old. Amanda was a little older than her. She actually turned 15 during this point where they were talking. So when they first met, she was 14, but she ended up turning 15 not long after. So unfortunately, the relationship that Shanda had with Amanda would end up leading to the young girl's death. And that's because Amanda was the ex-girlfriend of another girl at school, Melinda Lovelace. And Melinda Lovelace would be the ringleader who would not only facilitate and plan the kidnapping, torture, and murder of Shanda, but she would be the one to go through with it. She would end up finding 3 other girls to go through with it with her. Melinda was older than Shanda, but still incredibly young to even think about doing the things she ended up doing. She was only 16 years old when our story takes place. Melinda also had a less than ideal home life. Her parents, Larry and Marjorie, had a relationship that was rocky in every sense of the word. Her father would often cheat on her mother and also convince her mother to participate in sexual acts that she wasn't interested in, including partner swapping and orgies. When Marjorie would try to refuse Larry sex, he would rape her violently in front of their children, which included Melinda. Not only that, but Larry was not great at keeping jobs, and he was also not great with money. Outside of making sure the house was paid for, he wasn't concerned with making sure other things were taken care of. His children would often go without food, and Larry would also end up filing for bankruptcy. And it's not because he didn't have the money. He was just bad at budgeting his money. He'd spend his extra cash exclusively on himself on things that he wanted, but didn't necessarily need, like firearms and motorcycles. For a short period of time, Larry and Marjorie ended up having a complete turnaround with their life when Melinda was around 5 years old. Both of them ended up finding and actively participating in church. Larry would become very involved and would even end up serving as a marriage counselor within the church. But soon rumors started to spread within the church that Larry was trying to make passes at the women. Eventually, Larry would attempt to rape one of these women, which caused them to leave the church and go back to their old ways. Larry and Marjorie would end up divorcing when Melinda was 14 years old. Larry would send letters to Melinda for a short period of time, but eventually would remarry and cut all contact from his children. So needless to say, Melinda did not have the best childhood. And in March of 1991, she would end up coming out to her mother as a lesbian and that she was dating Amanda Heverin. And originally her mother was furious. This is the early 90s. It's not as widely accepted as it is now. And it upset her mother. But she would end up accepting her daughter and she would accept her daughter's relationship. But by that point, Melinda and Amanda's relationship had started to go downhill. The two had started to separate after a couple months. And then when Shanda came in, they pulled apart even more. So the girls did ultimately end up splitting up, but the split was not amicable. Melinda was very jealous. Melinda was very upset, and she became very aggressive with Shanda. And the first confrontation that she had with her publicly was when Shanda and Amanda went to a school dance together. It happened again when Shanda and Amanda went to a town festival together. And this time, the confrontation included threats. During this time, Melinda would also end up writing letters to Amanda about Shanda that were threatening in nature. And she would often talk about how she wanted Shanda dead. Now, these letters, Amanda's dad did turn these letters into the authorities, but as far as we know, nothing came of it. So Shanda's mom ended up being so distressed by the problems that were arising because of this relationship that she would end up taking Shanda out of the public school there, the Hazelwood Middle School, and she would put her in a private Catholic school, thinking that if she got Shanda away from these girls at school, then maybe she wouldn't be having the issues that she was having because Shanda was dealing with a lot of aggression from Melinda. Now, obviously, the problems did not stop. It was during this time period that Melinda would end up meeting another friend and probably one of her best friends, and that was Lori Tackett. They started their friendship around November that year, but by the end of the year, the two were spending most of their free time together. Lori's childhood was also very problematic. Her mother was very devout in her fundamentalist Pentecostal Christian religion, and her father was a repeat felon. One day, Lori's mother found out that Lori was changing into jeans when she got to school, which caused her to fly into a rage. This rage ended in her attempting to strangle Lori. Social services would ultimately end up being involved. As Lori got older, she pushed back more against her mother's religious upbringing and would rebel. She grew an interest in the occult, claimed to be possessed by demons, and was known to mess around on a Ouija board with her friends. Lori would end up engaging in self-harm, which would lead to multiple hospitalizations. One of these hospitalizations would have her placed in a psychiatric care, and it was there that she was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And at this point, she would also admit to having hallucinations in the past. Now, Lori also had two friends that didn't know Shanda or Melinda, but they knew Lori and they had interests in a lot of the stuff that Lori had interests in. And these two friends were Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence. Both of these girls showed an interest in things such as the occult and Ouija boards, and both girls would also have a history of self-harm. Toni Lawrence would additionally have a history of sexual abuse, which was supposed to have been met with counseling, but Toni never ended up actually going through with it. Lori Tackett's mother wasn't the biggest fan of Hope Rippey, as the girl introduced Lori to the Ouija board, and likewise, Hope's parents did not think that Lori was a good influence on Hope. All four of these girls would have varying degrees of mental and psychological and childhood trauma. And I don't say this as an excuse to what they did that night to Shanda, because there is no excuse. But it does kind of help fill in the gaps where you can, when people say, how can someone do something like this? Well, maybe this doesn't answer the question fully, but it points you in the correct direction. On January 10th, 1992, Lori Tackett, who was 17 years old at the time, would pick up Hope Rippey and Toni Lawrence, who were both 15 years old, and they would drive to Melinda Lovelace's house, who at the time was 16 years old. Now, this would be the first time that Hope and Toni would be meeting Melinda, and they were under the impression that they were going to go to a concert in Louisville, Kentucky that night. And so they got in the car and they drove with Lori. When they got to Melinda's house, the plan was to go to the concert. In fact, they all went up to Melinda's rooms. They tried on clothes, they tried on new shoes, they borrowed stuff to look cool for the concert because that was the plan. But also, part of the plan for that night was to go to Shanda's house, kidnap her, and kill her. Now, originally, when the girls did go up to the room, the plan initially started out not directly saying that they were going to kill Shanda that night, but that they were going to threaten her and they were going to scare her for stealing Melinda's girlfriend. But the plan progressed, and Melinda even pulled out a kitchen knife to say that that was what she was going to use to threaten Shanda with. Before I elaborate on the plans that the girls have for that night, know that I am going to be utilizing pictures of maps over this next portion and over portions in part 2. And the reason why I'm going to do that is because it's going to sound like we're traveling a lot, because we'll be talking about going from New Albany to Charlestown, from Charlestown to Jeffersonville, from Jeffersonville to Louisville, from Louisville to Madison, from Madison to Canaan. And it sounds like we're going a lot of places. But trust me when I say I am from one of these small towns. I'm originally from Madison, Indiana. And with the exception of Louisville, Kentucky, all these small towns are just butted right up next to each other. And you can get to them in no time. They're just right next to each other. So it sounds like we're going a lot of different places, but this is just small town life. They're literally just like a town over, and it's a very short distance. And I'll be showing you that with maps. And like I said, I'll use the maps on this next part when I am describing where we are going. And then I'll also use the maps in part 2 to remind you again of where we're going, because it sounds like a lot of traveling. And it is. They're in the car basically all night long with Shanda in the trunk for 7 hours. And they do drive around a lot, but distance wise, it's all really close proximity to each other. And for me, I grew up in the area, so it's nothing for me to think about. But I know a lot of you guys obviously aren't familiar with the area. And so I'm going to try to make it as clear as possible. So their plan that night was to leave Melinda's house in New Albany and travel to Shanda's father's house right next door in Jeffersonville, Indiana. And the plan was for Melinda to lie down in the backseat floorboard with a cover covering her up. And they planned to send Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence to Shanda's door to knock on the door to see if Shanda was home. And if she was home, to see if they could take her with them to meet up with her girlfriend Amanda to go to a place called the Witch's Castle, because Amanda wanted to talk to Shanda. And so that's what they did. And that's how their night started out. And in part 2, that's where we are going to pick up. We are going to pick up when they go to Shanda's house and knock on the door, and Shanda's horrible night will begin. I think we all know the cast by now. I think we have a pretty good grasp on who these girls are and what their background is. And I hope that by doing that, we can keep them straight when we go into the next part. I have already started working on writing the script for part 2. I will honestly probably have part 2 filmed by the time you are watching the edited version of this video. My goal for this series is to get them out as quickly as possible while maintaining quality on the videos. I want this story to be told, and I want you to get the resolution from the case. I want you to make it to the end with me. This story does not have a happy ending. This story, like I said, what Shanda went through that night is horrible, and it is horrific. And after everything is said and done, after the arrests are made, after the trials are had, I know we're dealing with children, but I don't know if justice is served. And you'll just have to stick with me until the end of the series to see if you agree or disagree. But I look forward to going through it with you, and I look forward to hearing your opinions, and I look forward to getting it off my chest. Because, like I said, this is the story that has always sat with me the most. And I think, like I said, this happened in my own backyard at the place that I grew up, and it happened in my lifetime. So it's the one that resonates with me. I've walked by the places in this story. I have seen the places that a lot of these events happened, and very somber. But I appreciate you sticking around for part one. I will let you know when part two drops. If you want to be notified immediately when part two drops, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and make sure you have post notifications turned on. I will be going back and editing the description in this video, and in the description box, once I have part two uploaded, I will include that in the description box here as well for easy jumping. Until then, until next time, like I always say, my friends, I hope you take care. I hope you stay safe, and I will talk to you later. All right, guys. Bye.